Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today's video is going to be all about how indigenous languages influenced Portuguese. Before we get into today's video, if you hadn't heard already, I set up a Discord for the channel. Discord is a platform where you can chat with people who share common interests with you on dedicated servers. So I have set up a server for the channel where we can chat in Portuguese and English about topics related to the videos that I make on my channel. So whether you'd like to improve your Portuguese or your English, or you just simply like to talk in greater detail about topics related to Portuguese, linguistics, or other cultural things related to them, you can feel more than welcome to join us on the Discord. The invite link to the Discord is on my channel as well as in the description of my videos. And the only thing that I'm asking that you do when you have joined the Discord is to introduce yourself and click on an automated message in order to gain access to the chats. This is just to prevent spam since the server is open to the public. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, come chat with us on Discord. Also, if you're enjoying the videos that I make on my channel and you'd like to support me more directly, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon is a place where you can basically buy me a coffee each month, and in return you get access to exclusive extras. Those extras include things like knowing about what I'm working on next first, sources and other materials that I find as I'm doing my research for my videos, and even fun things like postcards from me to you. I also have a patrons only chat set up on the Discord. So if that sounds interesting to you, head on over to patreon.com/Sashinka where you can find out all of the details. Now, let's get back to the video. So today's video is going to be focusing on how indigenous languages influenced Portuguese. Naturally, this means that we're going to be focusing more on Brazilian Portuguese, but that's not to say that European Portuguese is not itself without indigenous influences. This comes in the form of words that are commonly used even in Portugal in Portuguese to this day. We will get into these lexical influences a little bit later on, but before we get into how indigenous languages influenced Portuguese, it's important to take a step back and look at the situation of indigenous languages before European contact. Before indigenous peoples first came into contact with European colonists, there existed a wide variety of languages spoken in many different language families all across South America and even the Atlantic coast of South America that would later on come to be known as Brazil. The name Brazil was given to the Portuguese colonies early on. This is based on the Brazil wood tree that grew naturally in Brazil and was a valuable export to Europe. And so on the Atlantic coast of South America, the principal ethnic groups were the Tupi-Guarani groups. So when we're talking about indigenous influences on the Portuguese language, we are mostly talking about influences from Tupi. There are influences in Portuguese in the form of words borrowed from other indigenous linguistic groups, but the Tupian languages are the biggest influencer on the Portuguese language itself. Other languages in the Tupi-Guarani family are even still spoken to this day. Nearly the entire population of neighboring Paraguay speaks Guarani. And among these groups, there is of course one that is most widely spread and their language most widely spoken. These were the Tupinambá natives and their form of Tupi. The language of the Tupinambá came to be known in Portuguese as lingua brasilica. This is because the language of the Tupinambá was the main language that the Portuguese were coming into contact with. It was the language that Portuguese colonists would learn when they went to Brazil and established their colonies and their new way of life in the new continent. And indeed, this language served as the lingua franca even among the native populations themselves. In particular, the Jesuits made quick work of using the lingua brasilica in their missionary work. The Jesuits took it upon themselves to convert the natives to Christianity, and in doing so they categorized and systematized the lingua brasilica. This, of course, is because their missionary work was carried out in the local native languages. This is a widespread phenomenon that we see pop up in the colonies of both the Portuguese and the Spanish across both North and South America. As Portuguese colonization of Brazil advanced and more Europeans came to the new continent, lingua brasilica came to fall under the umbrella of what were known as the linguas gerais. The linguas gerais were the indigenous languages spoken by the settlers settlers, as well as the local indigenous populations, and the native-born populations of mixed ancestry. Lingua Brasilica came to refer not strictly to the language of the Tupinamba, but in fact to the systematized and simplified form of the Tupi language that was used by the Jesuits and their indigenous converts. This form of the lingua geral continued to be called Lingua Brasilica, and it remained a natural form of the Tupian language that preceded it. This is to say that it had not undergone a dramatic process of creolization. That language came to be relegated to the northern part of Brazil and lives on to this day in the form of the language Nhangatu. The Nhangatu language is nowadays spoken in the Amazon rainforest in the very north of Brazil and southern Venezuela. On the other hand, the coastal or southern lingua geral, based out of São Paulo, was in fact a creolized form of Tupi. It had Tupi as its base language, which means that it had a mostly Tupian lexicon and many elements of Tupian grammar, but its grammar was simplified and heavily influenced by Portuguese. It is nowadays considered to have either been a Creole outright or a semi-Creole. This was the lingua geral of the Bandeirantes, and it was very widespread across Brazil for a couple of centuries. For a long time, this lingua geral was so prevalent that Portuguese envoys to the Brazilian colonies needed translators in order to communicate with local populations. And this situation persisted through the 1600s. It wasn't until the 1700s that the lingua geral fell into decline. The decline of the lingua geral happened naturally at first, with a greater influx of European settlers and continual social pressure on the languages used. But the switch from indigenous languages as the common language of the people to Portuguese happened by force upon a decree by Marquês de Pombal. A decree in the late 1700s by Marquês de Pombal made Portuguese the only official language of Brazil. It heavily penalized the use of languages that were not Portuguese and was fairly strictly enforced in major population centers in Brazil. This led to, in the 1800s, the swift and complete erasure of the lingua geral from the linguistic panorama of Brazil. By the beginning of the 1900s, there were no longer any native speakers of lingua geral. And yet in all of those centuries, the indigenous languages left their mark on Portuguese. The most pervasive influence that Tupi-Guarani had on the Portuguese language is, of course, in the form of words. There is a massive amount of vocabulary in the Portuguese language that derives from Tupi-Guarani. The bulk of these terms refer to plants and animals that Europeans had not previously known, but many lexical items referring to ways of life and other aspects of Tupi-Guarani society were also incorporated into the Portuguese language. Just as well, and highly predictably, the indigenous languages also gave Brazil quite a lot of its place names. There are indigenous names for places across the entirety of Brazil. 13 states themselves have a name that has an indigenous etymology. And of all of the states in Brazil, 7 of their capitals have indigenous etymologies as well. The capital of Paraíba, João Pessoa, was known as Paraíba until the 1930s. Evidently, Paraíba itself also has an indigenous etymology. For as vast as its lexical contributions were to Portuguese, Tupi had very little influence on Portuguese grammar. The only traces of Tupi grammar that we have left in Portuguese are in fact a couple of suffixes. We have the suffix rana, which means similar to. There's also the guara or wara suffix, which means of or from a place. In Brazilian Portuguese, we see this suffix appear mostly in demonyms. This suffix is not the preferred suffix in use for demonyms in Brazil. That suffix would in fact be ins, but some demonyms with guara or wara still exist today. Somebody from Manaus could be said to be a manauara, somebody from Pará could be said to be a parauara, and somebody from Marajó could be said to be a marajoara. But with that being said, the grammatical contributions to Portuguese from Tupi-Guarani are pretty much null. There are, however, still phonological traces of the indigenous languages in Brazilian Portuguese. The most famous example of this is one that I've talked about on this channel at length. If you've seen my video all about R in Portuguese, then you know that I'm talking about the Caipira R. To sum that up quickly, because the indigenous languages lacked the equivalent of the Portuguese hard R in their phonemic systems, their approximations in making this sound resulted in the sound characteristic of the Caipira dialect in Brazil nowadays. If you'd like to learn more about that, I highly recommend you watch the video. But there is one other main indigenous influence on Brazilian phonology. That is something that I have also talked about on this channel, and I am am referring to epenthesis, or in Portuguese, epentes. It is hypothesized that the insertion of a vowel between consonant clusters in Brazilian Portuguese is the result of Afro-Indigenous influences on the phonetic system of Portuguese. This form of epenthesis where a vowel is added can be known as anaptixis or sfarabakti. The tendency in Portuguese of avoiding two or more consonants grouped together in fact goes back to the earliest days of the Portuguese language. This tendency is one that is widely documented in the shift from Vulgar Latin to Galaico-Portuguese. And so it can be said that this is a natural tendency of Portuguese itself. Yet European Portuguese did not develop the same tendency of saying things like advogado, pneu, ritmo, and so on. And so the broadest linguistic consensus available to us at this time is that this pre-existing feature of Portuguese itself was brought out and complemented by African and indigenous languages. The mostly Bantu languages spoken by the enslaved African population in Brazil also exhibit the feature of avoiding consonant clusters. This is also very much the case of the Tupi-Guarani languages. As a result, as these groups shifted to using Portuguese as their main language, this natural avoidance of consonant clusters would constitute something of a phonological holdover. This has persisted into Brazilian Portuguese to this day and is represented across all of Brazil to varying degrees. And with that said, that's pretty much the extent of the most consensual indigenous influences on Portuguese. There are, of course, other theories that exist of indigenous influences that reach much further and wider in Brazilian Portuguese especially, but many of those are either controversial or have been discarded by linguists altogether. But regardless, if you're like me and you find indigenous and minority languages to be quite fascinating, and you have something more that you'd like me to talk about on my channel about them, leave me a comment down below. So that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.